Hello, everyone. My name is Genevieve Wiegleb, and I'm the Communications Associate with the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. I'm so excited to welcome you to our advocacy webinar today on International Myotonic Dystrophy Awareness Day. Before we begin, a little bit about the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, our vision. We envision a world with treatments and a cure for myotonic dystrophy. And our mission is supporting and connecting the myotonic dystrophy community. We provide resources and advocate for care, and we accelerate research towards treatment and a cure. MDF is here to support you. We have toolkits and publications, which you can find at myotonic.org/toolkits-publications. And we have support programs led by trained community volunteers that create safe spaces to network, learn, and share. You can find more about those on our website at www.myotonic.org/find-support. On our digital academy, you can view all of our past webinars and a lot of other interesting information. You can find that at that link there, myotonic.org/digital-academy. And you can find all of our upcoming events on our calendar at myotonic.org/calendar/month. Stay in touch with us. You can follow us on social media to make sure you're up to date on all things myotonic dystrophy and MDF. You can find MDF on Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. You can also sign up for emails so that you can get direct emails with all sorts of updates. Coming up, I just want to highlight a couple of events that are coming up. We have our Ask the Expert webinar on pediatric endocrinology this September. Find more information about that series at myotonic.org/ask-expert-series. We also have a Meet the DM drug developers coming up on October 3rd with Sanofi. You can find more information and sign up to attend at myotonic.org/meet-dm-drug-developers. We are going to have a lovely presentation from Kevin here in a moment, and we'll follow that with a Q&A. So you'll be able to ask questions live. To ask questions live, you click the Q&A button to open up that window, and then you can type your question into the text field and send it in. If you'd like to send it anonymously, you are welcome to do so by checking the box that says send anonymously, and you click send. I'm excited to introduce Kevin Brennan. He is MDF's advocacy consultant in Washington, D.C., and he has been our advocacy consultant since 2015. I will go ahead and turn it over to Kevin.
Genevieve, thank you very much. So it's really nice to be with you all today to celebrate International Myotonic Dystrophy Awareness Day. And I think most importantly, to honor individuals with myotonic dystrophy, caregivers, researchers, and clinicians who are all doing so much to get us closer to the day that we have, FDA-approved treatments and eventually a cure for this rare genetic disease. This is always a good opportunity when we talk about advocacy and we do our annual Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation webinar on September 15th, that about 3 years ago, 2022, is the date that the United States Senate passed the resolution that didn't create International Myotonic Dystrophy Awareness Day, but it was a major effort on the part of the foundation to build awareness and to get congressional recognition of something that we had already been doing internationally for a while. But I think it's always an important reminder that it was a really important resolution that was introduced, bipartisan resolution introduced by Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, a Democrat, and Senator Cynthia Lummis from Wyoming, who's a Republican, who worked together to get this resolution passed. And we're going to begin our presentation after honoring them for that. So what are we going to talk about today? What are you going to learn about today? So one is we want to update folks on where we stand as far as our research priorities, our research advocacy priorities, which we outlined at the beginning of this year, that all align with the organizational strategic plan. And then we want to talk about what is our call to action, which is focused on NIH research funding. We'll talk a little bit more about where we are with that. Want to talk a little bit, since it's Myotonic Dystrophy Awareness Day, about opportunities to advance additional proclamations at the state, local, and even in your local community to continue, to spread the word and create awareness about, the urgency that we all feel about improving the lives of individuals living with myotonic dystrophy. And then lastly, I want to just give you a little bit of an idea of where we're headed advocacy-wise heading into next year, because we're already starting and planning for that. Next slide, please. So our priorities were several-fold. The first one was to secure our 9th year in a row of eligibility for the peer-reviewed medical research program. You've probably heard me say this 1,000 times now, but the acronym for that is PRMRP. And I'll explain a little bit more about that for folks who might be new to our advocacy program. And then our next goal, as we started the year, was to obtain a $10 million earmark in dedicated funding only for myotonic dystrophy that was part of the larger CDMRP program, which is the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. So we'll talk about that in a minute. And then the last one is just to continue our advocacy to protect and advance funding for the National Institutes of Health, which includes, a funding for researchers around the country that are engaged in work around myotonic dystrophy. So we'll talk about where all three of those priorities are right now. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a chart which we've updated, which will show you kind of where we are over the last decade or so in our efforts to secure funding. So you can see here the top line. I know it's a little skewed here, but this is supposed to stand for the fiscal year. So FY, and you'll see 1-3. The 3 is a little bit lower, but that stands for the fiscal year 2013. And it runs all the way up to 2024 as far as actual dollars there. So you can see that, as we've talked about before, within the National Institutes of Health, myotonic dystrophy funding has been low and hasn't really changed much at all. The current fiscal year 2024, we have $9 million for the upcoming 2025 fiscal year. Those grants and reviews are all pending. But we've succeeded in getting about $124 million over that time frame that's funded researchers, at the University of Florida, and you can see some of the logos that we've included there. Stanford, Mass General, Children's National here in Washington, D.C., the University of Albany up in New York, University of Rochester also in New York, and then Virginia Commonwealth University. There's several more institutions we could have listed there, but these are all folks who have received grant funding, either through the NIH or through CDM or PRMRP, which is under CDMRP. As we've talked about before, around fiscal year 2018, we made a concerted organizational effort to advocate to be included in the PRMRP program. And again, that's a large program, which I'll talk about in a bit. Our researchers compete for dollars. You can see some of those funding levels that we have in there now. Over our course of several years being eligible, that's increased DM research funding by about $26.5 million. So that nets us a total of $150 million in research that we're funding around the country to help, again, expand our understanding of the causes of myotonic dystrophy, and really, most importantly, to help get closer to the day where we have treatments. So that just gives you a sort of a level set on where things stand there. Next slide, please. Okay, so our peer-reviewed medical research program request was successful. We have been included now in that program for 9 years in a row. I think I made a typo there. And as I said, that's funded $26.5 million in research funding, not including this coming year, which will hopefully happen soon. And just wanted to highlight, we've done a really good job of building support in the Senate for this particular program. It is only exists in the United States Senate's Defense Appropriations Bill. So when we advocate for PRMRP, we only are asking senators to support it. So Senator Bob Casey, who was defeated last November from Pennsylvania, had been a longtime champion of ours. Senator Durbin from Illinois, who is actually retiring at the end of next year, and then Senator Feinstein, who was our original champion. It was thanks to Senator Feinstein from California and her support that we got into the program to begin with. So we want to just honor some of the folks, current and past, who have been helpful. And you'll see in an upcoming slide a few folks who we're beginning to develop into new champions on the Senate side for this. Next slide, please. So the PRMRP being a success, you saw that. So we're in there again. That's important. That happened over the summer. Good news. The other request that we've made, right, is for the $10 million for the CDMRP program. So we want that $10 million in funding. So this is the second year in a row that we've been advocating for this amount of funding. And this is a difficult request. I think it's always important to understand that the Congress doesn't add new funding programs for CDMRP easily, and it takes time to build champions to get us there. So this year, we've been working the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives, and the Senate, right? We've been working towards both of those because both of them have a say in what gets added or what gets maintained in the CDMRP program. So this year, which was a bit of a strange year for congressional appropriations, and the reason for that was usually the fiscal year, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this as we look to, the balance of the year. Pardon me. The federal fiscal year runs through September 30th, and the new fiscal year starts on October 1st. And last year, Congress made a conscious decision to fund the government up until the middle of March, instead of funding it all the way through to September 30th. So a new administration comes in January. President Trump is sworn in. Congress, one of their first orders of business is trying to figure out how they're going to fund the government through the rest of the year. So all of that happening led to a lot of changes, and it sort of made it a little bit harder for groups like ours to mobilize our advocates in support of our priorities. So the letter here that's up on the screen was signed by 5 members of Congress, and it was led by Congressman Jared Moskowitz from Florida. It was also signed by Congressman McGovern, who is from Massachusetts, Stephen Horsford, who's from Nevada. We've got Republican Congresswoman Jen Kiggins, who's from Virginia Beach, Virginia. Moskowitz and Kiggins were the initial leaders of last year's letter. And then Maggie Goodfellow from New Hampshire is the other Democrat that's on there too. I think if we had had more time to mobilize our grassroots and to do the work we did, we'd have far more signatures on here than we did. So that was a bit of a challenge. I think we did as well as we could under those circumstances. But that letter, I know it's a little bit, the type is a little bit hard to read, but that went to the chair and ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, the Defense Subcommittee that decides the CDMRP priorities. So let's go to the next slide and we'll see the Senate letter. Okay, so Senator Klobuchar, who had led last year's letter, continued to lead that letter. And the senators who signed that were Warnock of Georgia, Tim Kaine of Virginia, Gillibrand of New York, also Brooks, and Van Hollen from Maryland. So we're starting to build more support. You'll notice, though, that we're light on Republican support. And so one of the focus that we're going to have going into the next year is to how do we continue to reach out to folks. I think that there's, in my experience this year, there's been a real reluctance to support things where they're from the Republican side of the aisle, where there's a perception that you're increasing the deficit or you're spending money. You folks who have been following the news over the last couple of months may have seen that there's been an effort to trim government, to terminate federal employees, to cut programs. And so in keeping with that, you're finding that a lot of Republicans tend to be a little bit reluctant to sign on to letters publicly or to commit themselves publicly to things where they're seen as kind of going against that tide, where they're actually asking for funding. And um, this is not unique to myotonic dystrophy. I have numerous friends of mine who work in different places, who work with other disease advocacy groups, patient advocacy groups. I've seen this with one of the groups I work with in the Down syndrome space, where there's a bill legislation that's designed to increase support for work that's happening at the NIH around Down syndrome, and there's been a reluctance to do that. So I think folks shouldn't take it personally. We just need to figure out ways to reach and develop relationships. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to build our congressional champions. So next slide, please. So going back to our success with PRMRP this year, this is just a snapshot of what this legislation looks like. So to the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see the Department of Defense Appropriations Bill for 2026. This is the cover of the appropriations bill that the Senate voted out of committee. And Mitch McConnell from Kentucky is the chair of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. Some folks may recognize his name. He had been for a long time the Republican Senate leader, sometimes in the majority, sometimes in the minority, but he stepped aside for John Thune, who stepped up and is now the Senate Majority Leader in the Senate. Chuck Schumer is the ranking Democrat, since the Republicans now have a majority, the Democrats are in the minority. But this reflects, what the copy of that bill looks like. And then what I've done is I pulled the language out that has the PRMRP program. And you can see here where it recommends $370 million. And there's a whole bunch of conditions in there. I actually had to pull a few of the names out because I wanted to keep it a little briefer so it would fit on the slide. But there's a few other rare and not so rare conditions that are here. And all of these conditions are eligible to submit, if you're a researcher doing research in a certain area, as long as that the condition or disease that you're researching appears on this list, you can submit a grant application. And so we do a lot with the program so that our researchers are equipped and ready to apply for those funds when they become available. And we've done a lot of work in webinars and things to get folks teed up to do it, because it's different than the program for the NIH. But just wanted folks to see what we were able to accomplish. So this bill, even though I'm going to get to where we are in the budget process, this is done. The Senate, once the Senate completes their work on this report and we're in it, that part of our job is over. And we'll talk about where the government funding saga that we're currently in, how does that impact it? But we'll get there in a minute. But there's no more advocacy that needs to be done this year specific to getting into the PRMRP program. We're in it. Next slide, please. Okay. So just wanted to give folks a little bit of a snapshot, like where are we year to date? One of our, really important organizational goals is to get as many people as possible, as many people living with myotonic dystrophy, as many caregivers, as many friends and family, as many researchers, clinicians, anyone who has, an interest in this cause. We want you to get involved. And so we're able to measure that when folks are on the website and responding to our action alerts, which we email out to the community and ask for your help to communicate to your two senators and your representative, asking for CDMRP funding or support for the CDMRP letters, or asking for support for our PRMRP request, or for our general NIH letters that have gone out. So you can go to myotonic.org, you go to the advocacy section, and you can find whatever our active campaigns are. You can pop in, take one of those preloaded letters. Of course, we always encourage folks to personalize them, to add a little bit of their story so that members see that they're real people at the other end of that keyboard, and it's not just some automated AI generated spam. It's really important that they see that. They recognize it regardless, but it shows that there's a little bit more passion behind it, which elevates in their minds that this is something that they should act on, versus they just get so many requests in the healthcare space and everywhere else to do so many things. So it's really, really important. So in 2024, This is over the course of the entire year. We had 2,734 email communications that went out through the website, and they came from 45 states. This year, with about a quarter of the year left, we've got 1,826 emails that have gone through the system. So I suspect we're going to exceed last year's overall number. And we've gotten folks from every single state except Alaska. So we're continuing to grow, our support, which is amazing, and we're grateful for that. But we got to continue to do more. We have to have more messages, and we have to have more personalized messages going to Congress. That's the thing that's going to get us our $10 million in CDMRP funding. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is just a snapshot. That's a picture of the floor of the House of Representatives, I think during one of the State of the Union addresses. It's a cool shot. I always like that shot. And so in an age and where, we have a deeply divided country, where many folks are cynical about, politics or political participation, I know it's hard sometimes to say, okay, great, now you're asking me to engage, with Congress. But I think it's just so absolutely important that you take a little bit of time if you're interested in become an advocate, because no one's going to do our job for us. This is an important opportunity to raise awareness. If we don't do it, who else is going to take up the banner of myotonic dystrophy, in Congress and asking for that? And the dollars that get spent will get spent on some other arguably worthy cause, but they won't get spent in an area where we care. So we can't blame Congress for not taking action on something that we don't ask them to do it, and we're the people to do it. Always remember, that you're a constituent. When you're reaching out to your two senators and your representative, those are folks that are coming to Washington to represent you, and they want to hear from you. So the more folks they hear from, the more likely it is that they're going to take our request seriously and elevate it and do something about it. And as always, your personal stories are just so incredibly important. They measurably improve the chances that we're going to be successful in securing more funding for myotonic dystrophy. Next slide, please. So to date, I wanted to give you guys a sense of kind of where things stand with the budget, right? So I talked about how the PRMRP funding is there. There wasn't support in the House or Senate to include the CDMRP funding, so that's not in there. So half of our, overarching goals we were successful in, but the other half we still have work to do. The third piece, which was the NIH piece, is the one that is still to be determined. So right now we've got about 2 weeks left before the fiscal year deadline hits, and Congress has to think about what they're going to do. And I'm going to get to a slide in a second that explains that. But right now, just to get a sense, when the president took office and submitted his first year budget request to Congress, there was a significant cut to NIH funding in that request. As I said, there's been a lot of focus around eliminating federal programs, scaling back the number of federal employees there to deliver those services, and NIH has been part of all of that. So the president basically said, we're going to cut NIH funding by $18 billion. So it's a total funding amount of 31, roughly, $billion is what he proposed. Now, a budget, when it's sent to Congress, is a recommendation. Under the Constitution, under Article 1, Congress has the power of the purse. So whatever they get from the president, regardless of party, and whoever runs the White House, they get to decide whether they think that's too high, just right, or too low. So in this case, Congress, and again, both bodies are, the majorities in House and Senate are both Republican. So, and the president's a Republican. So this is a unified, executive branch and Congress. But what you're seeing here, and this has been unique this year, you're seeing the House and Senate strongly disagreeing with the president's recommendation on NIH funding. So I'm going to go to the blue line first, which is the Senate number. And the Senate passed their bill over the summer, late summer. And they had about $48.7 billion in research funding that was included in their bill. I'm sorry, but a cat has just entered the screen here and he's going to go back. We'll see him later. Um, so we've included the $48.7 billion for what the Senate included in their bill, which is fantastic. We're really, really pleased to see that the Senate recognizes that NIH is doing such important work in rare disease research and even in common and chronic diseases like cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, you name it. So they came back and said, hey, we're not gonna, that's not where we're gonna go. I think that doesn't appear on this chart, but I think equally important is there's been an interest in making some changes to the NIH and scaling back the number of institutes that are there. And the Trump administration indicated they wanted to eliminate some institutes, combine several institutes. There's language in this bill that the Senate included that said, we're open for reform. We want to talk to you about those things, but they can't be done through the funding process. They have to be done through public hearings, and conversations with stakeholder groups like the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation and our research community to share what we think would be the optimal structure for the NIH going forward. The House has some similar language. The House bill, which just passed about a week or so ago, includes about $48 billion in funding, so pretty close to the Senate number. So there's not a huge disagreement between the House and Senate around what the NIH number should be. But that's where things stand as of today, as far as where things are headed. And I'll get into what I think the future holds. Next slide. So we're now in, a budgetary end game. So as I mentioned, the fiscal year ends September 30th. Congress kind of has two options here, although I'm going to say there's a third option I'm going to get to in a minute. But essentially, they can pass all the appropriations bills and a final budget, do that between now and September 30th, and government's funded and everything generally would move along. And that's how the system is generally supposed to work. It might be how you learned about, the appropriations process in high school civics, but it's not kind of the way things are working now. Further, the House and Senate have passed a lot of their appropriations bills, but they have to get together and reconcile those differences where they exist. And there's really not a whole lot of time, between today, September 15th, and September 30th to work out all of those differences. So I think the chances of them passing, full budgets for these different departments and programs is unlikely. So then the question is, well, then what happens, right? So one is they don't pass anything, they can't get any agreement on this, and the government shuts down until they can reach agreement. And I'll explain a little bit more in a second why that may or may not happen. The other options are they pass what's called a continuing resolution, which is exactly how it sounds. They would continue government funding largely at the current fiscal year levels for some predetermined period of time. Currently, what's being discussed is trying to get a short-term CR that extends those funding levels through mid-November, thus buying Congress more time to try to reach agreement on bipartisan appropriations bills that would fund the government until next September 30th. The other option being discussed more by the White House than anyone is this idea of a longer term CR that would pull funding at these current levels through January. There's a lot of different, inside baseball reasons as to why some folks like and don't like those options. But I think those are kind of the two now that are on the table, right? So what prevents Congress from actually getting all of that done? Some of it's been a lack of trust, which I probably don't need to tell folks here, but in the congressional sense, there's been something called budget sequestration, where they go back to a previous fiscal year. They take a bunch of money that hasn't been spent, but Congress agreed to and wrote into law, and they get rid of that funding. They just did it recently for a bunch of funding for foreign aid programs, also for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And so the reason why there's a lack of trust is it's kind of a math problem. In order to pass a budget, you have to get over the threat of a filibuster. And to avoid a filibuster, you have to get 60 votes in the Senate. Because the Republicans have 53 Senate seats that they occupy, but not 60. So they worked with the Democrats to cut a deal last March on what the continuing resolution would look like, right? So they said, okay, the Democrats said, we'll give you a couple of our votes, so to speak. A couple of our members are going to support this bill, and we're going to agree that this is the law of the land on the budget. So after they reach that deal and they pass a budget law, months later, the administration gives them a sequestration bill that would remove some of the funding from the bill they agreed to in March, that the Democrats felt they had a handshake agreement deal that they then signed into law, but it only takes 50 votes to pass sequestration. So if you're sitting in a Democratic Senate office and you're saying, well, wait a minute, we gave you the votes to do that, then you guys turned around and you decided to take the stuff out of that bill that you didn't like, that there was stuff that we didn't like either, but now we don't have any leverage. You can pass that sequestration with just Republican votes and we can't stop it. So that's left a little bit of a bad taste in the mouths of some Democrats. And again, folks who were watching and paying attention to this issue in March may have remembered that Chuck Schumer, who is the Democratic Senate leader from New York, initially said, we're going to shut the government down. We're not going to support this CR in March. I'm not going to have my members vote for it. And then he decided sort of the last minute to change course and agreed to do it. And a lot of the Democratic base really let him have it for doing that. So I think he's under some political pressure to not do the same thing all over again. And so I think there's that part. So the other piece I think that you're hearing from Democrats is they, under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, however you want to describe it, where people are able to buy health plan coverage through the exchanges, whether it's the federal exchange or your state-based exchange, right? Key to that is the fact that it prohibits people from discriminating against individuals who want to buy insurance who have a pre-existing condition like myotonic dystrophy. Part of that deal was that some folks who were more low income would get some subsidies from the federal government to allow them to buy health insurance coverage. Those subsidies, those premium supports are going to expire at the end of the year. And so the Democrats are saying we would be willing to, give you the votes in the Senate if you would support having that program extended for some period of time. There is some bipartisan support for that office, that position. In fact, Congresswoman Kiggans, who I mentioned earlier, is leading an effort in the House to try to extend those. But there's other folks, particularly on the more far-leaning side of the Republican Party, who feel that there's fraud here that needs to be addressed, and they want to put in income support, restrictions on that. And there already, I believe, currently are some income restrictions, but I think they want to lower those for folks. So those are probably going to be some of the things you'll be hearing, reading about over the next several weeks as this dance continues. I think at this point, if I had to make a prediction, it would be that there was going to be a limited government shutdown. I think that there's a game of chicken being played, and I think they're underestimating, where, say, the Democrats are on this, and they think that Schumer is going to fold again. But we'll kind of see, where that lands. After all of that political prognostication, the bottom line that you're asking yourself, okay, Kevin, great. What does that mean for us, and what does that mean for the PRMRP program? So what it means is we're in a holding pattern until they get a final budget agreement, until they have either a year-long CR or they reach agreement on, a final defense appropriations bill. So these are things that kind of are above all of our pay grade, but the action item that we're going to get to is all of us communicating to Congress of, hey, we care about NIH funding. This is important. We want to see you guys come to some agreement and get this over the finish line. So we're going to use, our voice along with many other groups, I think in the patient advocacy space that are saying the same thing. So next slide, please. So here's where you need to go. As I said, go to, myotonic.org. This is what, a snapshot of the Action Center looks like. So you can see where there's on the right-hand side where you can compose a message to Congress. It also gives you the option to place a phone call. But these are things that are loaded, ready to go. And again, the opportunity is there to personalize that message. So thank you all who have done that. Thank you for those who are going to do it after today's webinar. And we'll talk a little bit more about other things that folks can do going into next year. Next slide, please. Okay. So one of the volunteer job descriptions that we've created and are filling now is the state advocacy captain position. So those of you may recognize this is Uncle Sam from World War II, where he's asking individuals to join the cause, join the military, take on some civilian position to help us win the war in Europe. We're not obviously at war. We're asking folks to join what I think is an important and noble cause. Just a couple of things you need to do. We're trying to give folks, this is hopefully not a big, scary position, but what we're trying to do is organize around the states where we have, one or more folks who, either singularly or in coordination with other state advocacy captains help coordinate the activity that we need to do over the course of each year. And you can involve recruiting new folks, to get on the website, to participate, to join some of the virtual meetings, and even in person if you want to try to swing those with members of Congress and their staff. But really, it's about sharing your story, but doing it in an organized fashion and in a way that we will help you do. So next slide, please. So again, as we think about some of this and what we've done over the course of this last year and what we anticipate doing next year is, so in February and March of this year, we had our advocacy captains help organize and request meetings with Senate and House offices. And why that's important is while we want to have as many voices heard in these offices through calls and emails, when we're doing the actual virtual meetings on behalf of the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation, we want to make sure there's one person who's accountable for setting those up and that the offices aren't getting hit with, if you're in California, 20 different people who are asking for those meetings. We want to make sure that it's focused, it's organized, and that's one thing we would do. So if you're in, the position as a state advocacy captain, you'd be organizing particularly those two Senate meetings, figuring out who in your state would join those virtual meetings. We'll help you with your Zoom link, all of the technical pieces. We'll work with you in advance to set up the talking points, help you think about how to do the follow-up, but all of that stuff is really important and it happens really early in the year. And so, sorry, I keep getting a cat who really wants to be on the Zoom. And so we'll provide you with all the meetings and all of the work there. Really, and then folks who, you might have a lot of folks who are like, look, I just would like to send an email or do a phone call. You'd be helping recruit and organize those folks too. All of that I help as a focal point of organization. So we will not leave you out in the lurch. We want to help you and support you and teach you, most importantly, how to become an advocate. I think that's one of the best things that we've done, and the thing that honestly I find most gratifying is when we've developed folks who didn't know who their member of Congress was, and there's no shame in that, to being like, I know who my member of Congress is. I know who the staff person is who does healthcare. I know when they're doing meetings back in our state or our district. I go to those meetings. I ask questions. I understand kind of where the process is. So that's what we want to get to. We want to have people all over the country who have that level of experience and knowledge and who can lead those conversations with Congress. Next slide, please. So one other thing to think about, and I'm going to be a little brief on this one, but is to talk about, again, we're celebrating and honoring International Myotonic Dystrophy Awareness Day. This is an important tool for two reasons when you think about advocacy. One is it helps our larger organizational imperative, which is increasing awareness, right? The second thing is this is a great way to help advocates learn about their government and how to be an advocate, right? So proclamations, unlike funding for CDMRP or PRMRP or NIH, generally don't cost any money, right? Generally, they're things that members, in the state or in the local level want to do because they're not that hard. And, they probably have multiple ones each week. But what's great about it is you get to interact with those folks, you get to work with them, you get to bring that across the finish line. There's different ways that these things get done, at the state and local level. In the most cases, somebody who has executive authority, head of your town council, head of your city council, your mayor, any number of those folks, or even your legislature can get these things, done. And it's really just about, the cost of printing the paper. But it gives you a chance then to, have a little bit of a photo op with that member, a picture of the proclamation, something we can post on the website. It may even lead you to have an opportunity down the road to light up a city or light up an important building in town. But it's a really low cost, easy way to kind of navigate and start to learn how to be an advocate. So next slide. So as I said, some offices might have something as simple as an application that you need to fill out, or you can send a short email or letter, asking them how the process goes. But really, it's important that you ask. There is, like I said, there is no uniform national approach to this. So you're going to have to take a little bit of a chance to pick up the phone or the email and talk to your folks. And it's okay to ask a question, and it's okay to say, I don't have a clue if and how we do this, but I'm here on behalf of the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. We want to know if this is something that, our, city council or our legislature, or if the mayor and governor do. Most, almost all the time, the answer is going to be yes. And they will point you to what you need to do to make it happen. Like I said, this is an easy one for them to do, which is why they generally like to do it and are going to want to work with you to do it. Next slide. So again, you can provide a sample proclamation that we have up on the website. You can ask to make a public presentation, which again is going to just be a matter of talking about, well, why should we do it? Well, how many people, have myotonic dystrophy? What is the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation doing? What are we seeing in research, and where are we seeing ourselves on the road to treatments? All of that stuff is in that proclamation. It's easy to make the case as to why we are a worthy cause that warrants a proclamation. And again, what is universal about elected officials and political people is they like to get their pictures taken, and they like to be associated with a good cause. So chances are, if they're interested in the proclamation, you're able to bring that over the finish line, they're going to want to take a picture with you. They're going to want to promote it on their website or through their newsletter. We're certainly going to want to do the same. So again, it's a great opportunity to create awareness and to learn a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the governmental process. So next slide. And then this is just a copy of the Senate resolution that I mentioned in the very start of my presentation. It was Senate Resolution 336. I proudly have a signed copy from Senator Kane that sits above the desk in my office. And a lot of what's in here, even though I know it's a couple of years old, are largely the bullets that you're going to see in the template that we have. We try to update it, periodically as new data comes around. But these are sort of whereas clauses saying, whereas myotonic dystrophy affects these many people, whereas, and it talks about the different organ systems that are affected, whereas there's no FDA approved treatments, we dedicate, September 15th is Myotonic Dystrophy Awareness Day, and we dedicate ourselves to, finding the funding for research, and it's going to lead us to a cure. So again, all that stuff is available. Just let us know if you need it and you want to do it. We've had some great successes in Florida and a few other places around the country where folks have had really great experiences getting to know their elected folks here. Next slide. Okay, so now we're thinking about going into next year, right? So I know we're in a bit of a not sure what's going to happen with the government funding. How long could there be a shutdown if there is one? All of that stuff is kind of there. But what we're planning for next year, and we haven't set a date yet, but we're going to have a December webinar with folks, who are either interested or are currently serving as state advocacy captains. And our biggest priority going into next year is developing, what I like to call congressional champions. Okay. So what is a congressional champion? So you saw the letters that I had up on the screen, the House and Senate letters. Okay. So those were, I would describe as supporters. People that have stepped up and lent their name to our cause and say, this is important, right? Which is great. And that is an important level of support. But what we really need are folks who are going to be in the room where it happens, as they said in Hamilton, when they're writing the defense appropriations bill. And they say to the chair and ranking member of those subcommittees, I got three priorities, and one of them is getting $10 million from myotonic dystrophy. I want that in the bill. Okay. We're not there yet. We don't quite have a champion that's going to elevate our issue to the point where they're going in there and really demanding that, right? So how does that happen, right? Everybody looks and says, well, maybe you need a celebrity person to do it. Yeah, that can help. I've worked with groups that have identified celebrities who have something or have a relative who has passed away or has something, some, disease or condition, and that's great. That's helpful. But fundamentally, what we need to do is connect with these folks. We need to build relationships where they adopt our sense of urgency, where they are with us. They get what we're doing. And so sometimes that happens, lightning in a bottle, where you've got one advocate who just really connects. It's a young person. It's a young, child who is recently diagnosed, and talks them through, what's happening. And that just is that one thing that just turns them from being, oh, that's interesting, to I'm going to fight for you. It may be that you've just got a number of folks who are just, they're constantly, seeing that member when they're back home, or they're going to Washington, or they're generating so many personal emails, that starts to change the relationship that we have with that member. Sometimes it's finding what you'd call a KOL, or a key opinion leader, right? Somebody who has an oversized voice with that particular member. So that could be, a prominent member of the community or the state. It could be somebody that works for a large employer, or leads a large employer that employs a lot of people. Members of Congress universally care about anyone that's creating jobs in their state or congressional district. It could be somebody who just has a larger megaphone. Maybe it's somebody who's a large philanthropist, or somebody who has a history of being really involved politically, and maybe has been supportive of one party or another. We don't ever, as a nonprofit, violate, our tax status by getting into politics, but it doesn't mean we can't, identify and work with people who are politically active, who want to take on our cause as their own, and help us build those champions. So we're going to talk more about that in December. We're going to roll up our sleeves and really make that the priority, so that next year, we have more signatures on those two letters that I showed you, and that we start to get some members who start to be in a position where, when that door closes in the room where it happens, they're fighting for us, even though we're not there and we're not able to witness it, but we know, and that's the key. And that's what's really important. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk in December about really hitting the ground running in January, and with our CDMRP and PRMRP requests. The budget won't be out yet, but we're going to get a head start. We're going to really start to push offices and let them know that we're asking for their support. We're going to be asking for their signatures on those letters. Overarching that, as I said, is the president's budget submission, and SOTU, just as a fancy acronym for State of the Union. So in February generally is when that happens. That's usually what kicks off the appropriations season. We submit official requests to offices, the forms that they require, the paperwork usually. I do that on behalf of the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. And then again, the state advocacy captains come back into play. And once those are submitted, we're going to, fan out across the country, so to speak, and have everybody doing their meetings with their members of Congress, so that when those budgets get written in the early summer, we have a greater likelihood of getting, our 10th year of eligibility for PRMRP, and getting closer, if not to, our goal of the $10 million for CDMRP. Next slide, please. So just to round this all out, just wanted to include a quote that I like, that many of you may be familiar with, from Margaret Mead, that says, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. We are that small group of thoughtful, committed citizens, and I hope you will join us on our continuing efforts to change the world for people with myotonic dystrophy. I will pause, and Guinevere's going to get up, and we're going to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that lovely and informative presentation. We will now have the Q&A part of our webinar. Just a reminder for how to submit questions. There's a Q&A box probably at the bottom of your screen. You can click into that and type in your question and hit send. So let's go ahead and go through some of those questions. We do have some that were pre-submitted, so we can answer some of those. One of the questions that we had was, what are the best ways to reach out to representatives, and how do you get their attention?
So there's There's a lot of good ways to reach out, really. There's no one singular way, right? So, a couple of ideas. One is let's talk about if you're back in your, you're not traveling to Washington, D.C., you're home, right? You're in Arkansas or California or Oregon, and you want to talk to your member of Congress or your senator. Reach out to their office. Go on their website. You can see their office address and their phone numbers, and you can call anytime and say, "I'm with the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. I'd like to come in and talk to you or a member of your staff about our advocacy priorities." And so, you'll get an opportunity to tell your story, right? And that's what always, whether you're in Washington or whether you're back home, that's the sticky thing, right? Where you meet with, I mean, a healthcare person in Washington over the course of a week could talk to ambulance, companies, hospitals. You think of any number of physician specialty societies. You could talk to drug manufacturers, insurance companies, people that run ambulatory, outpatient clinics for surgical, services. Like the healthcare space is almost endless in the number of, interests that are there. But our story is one that will resonate and continue. So I think that's really important, that personal connection. You can also set up a Zoom call with the healthcare person who's based in Washington, right? Again, I think what's important is we try to do this organized level on the state level when we're talking about the senators and our representatives. So if you're aware that, in my congressional district, I know there's a couple of folks, bring them into that conversation so that you're all there talking together there. Because I think when you're requesting their time in a meeting, that part's important. When you're just doing the other piece, which is responding to an action alert around NIH funding, they can accept as many emails as you can send them. They have to be from the state or congressional district, right? So resist that temptation to say, well, I'm going to send it to, Senator Padilla from California, even though I'm from Connecticut. That email is going to get pitched to, Senator Murphy or Senator Blumenthal in Connecticut because in fairness, they don't have the resources to answer, emails from the entire country. They have the resources to answer communications from their state. So try to do that. But again, it's the personal story which is going to make a difference and is going to separate you out from all those other meetings, right? And don't be afraid to share the hard parts of this. I know that can be difficult, but and also make sure that you're trying to rehearse your story in advance. Make sure that you're really thinking carefully about it so that you're prepared, and you'll start to notice at times like somebody looking at their watch or somebody trying to figure out what their emails are. They're not trying to be rude. Well, I mean, some people will, but I mean, in general, they might just be busy. And so you really need to make sure that you take the 20 minutes to half hour that you have allotted, and you're really careful about how you use it. Don't spend a lot of time talking about the weather or about, hey, our kids might have played in the same high school football team together or whatever it is. Get down to business quickly because you might find all of a sudden you're halfway through your story and you're like, oh no, we're done. So just make sure you're mindful of that. So I think those are really important ways to do that. You can go to town halls. I know that they're not as frequent. August was kind of a bit of a mess because you had people going there with an agenda. And so now folks are pulling back. They want to talk about Medicaid. Before that, usually the conversations around reproductive health care or abortion or about, Second Amendment issues. It's kind of great. You'll stand out if you are able to speak at one of these events and you ask a question that's not one of those topics. Members almost go like, whew, that's great. Let's talk about this. This is a real issue that a real person's coming to talk to me about. So all really good, opportunities to do that.
Great, thank you. And just to kind of ask a little bit more detail, when someone has a meeting with a representative, how long would you say you might have for that meeting? How much time should you plan for?
I think anywhere from 15 minutes to a half hour. And I know that sounds brief, particularly on the 15-minute side, but a standard congressional meeting was about 15, maybe 20 minutes before COVID. When things went virtual and Zoom offered you that half-hour window, it kind of stretched it out a little bit. I think Congress is trying to push it back to 15 because they're trying to see as many of their constituents as they can, which is why they have kind of that limited time frame. But and also think about, if you have a clinician, the more perspectives that you can share, the better. So if your neurologist is able to go, or if you're from a place, say Rochester, Emily Jones, who's on our National Advocacy Committee, has done a great job of working with Charles Thornton, and they'll go in together to talk to their representatives and senators about what's happening. So the more of that you can do, of course, the better. But again, it all comes down to the individual with myotonic dystrophy in that story.
Thank you. We have another question. This person is sharing that their state delegation is 100% Democratic, and they're wondering how much input in budget discussions they might have if Republicans are controlling both chambers.
So that's a great question. I think it's going to depend. I mean, in the House of Representatives, Democrats have very little voice because of the way that body is the rules are laid out. In the Senate, because of the reasons I mentioned about the filibuster and the fact that it takes 60 votes to pass a budget, and they're going to need a few Democrats to come over, the Democrats probably have more leverage. And if there is a shutdown, it'll be because they can't break the filibuster. I think what's important to think about is that we're going to communicate to Republicans, Democrats, and independents in Congress, no matter what, and never miss out on a chance to build a relationship, whether it's a Democrat or Republican or whether, things flip. The midterm elections are not this November, but next. Historically, the party out of power that isn't in the White House or Congress takes over at least one body. So it might be, in 14 months, you have Democrats who are in charge in the House. Maybe, maybe not, but always know that things can change quickly, and we want to do that, even though it might be you're like, well, I don't really know that they're going to make a difference. It makes a difference. They want to hear from you, and that's all part of that relationship building that we're working towards as an organization.
Great. And we had another question submitted in advance asking for us to expand a bit on how funding happens for research in general, and who's responsible, what agencies to look for in terms of that.
Yeah, so once Congress passes the appropriations bills or the budget bills, it's up to the executive branch to execute that, right? It's to distribute the money within the parameters of the law. And there's been a real tension between the Trump administration and Congress right now because their Congress is allowing them to assume some of congressional responsibilities. So you may have read, earlier this year and a little bit in the middle of the year, the researchers that we were talking to were having their grants delayed or weren't arriving. And that was alarming to us. And we were communicating to Congress and to the White House that this was not going to help us get closer to our goal. And many other groups were doing the same. So that has been a process that's been being sorted out through the court system, where the federal courts are being engaged now to say, and largely have sided with NIH, if you will, or the researchers who are saying, hey, I went through the process. I was awarded this funding under, the peer review process, which is essentially the NIH and the PRMRP process, where you bring researchers together who have some knowledge of the specific area. They receive grant applications. They then grade them on their scientific merit, and then say the top 30% are awarded funding. So that's the process of how that gets funded. So there's really not a lot we can do to change that, except to make sure that our research community is, one, aware that those opportunities are there, know how to submit a grant for, CDMRP versus NIH. And then also folks have served as consumer reviewers who serve on those. So these are folks that have a chance to be a part of that. We've had a lot of folks who have participated in that. So that's our way of engaging. But in general, we've been more focused on trying to get the money through Congress, and then that process gets competed in the peer review space.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I just had one more question. Do you have any recommendations or thoughts, maybe like success stories of how folks get others in their community excited about research funding and interested in joining advocacy efforts?
I think that there's really no mystery to this. It's the same, there's a certain thread that kind of goes through all of this, right? So if you're doing an event to try to raise money for a good cause, whatever that might be, it's connecting with a person to say, um, this is my story. You understand what what I've been going through. You understand that I have very few options because there are no FDA approved treatments. One way to do that is to get funding, more funding through the NIH or CDMRP. I'll tell you an interesting story. I was up at the NIH last week and I was talking to a researcher who was from Australia. And there's a lot of researchers, by the way, from at NIH and around the country who are from other countries. And a lot of them came here because the NIH was this big beacon of hope and scientific opportunity, but most importantly, money. And this guy told me that he left Australia to come to the United States because the NIH budget at the time, and I'm sure this is still true, was way larger than the entire Australian defense budget. And so the smartest people in the world come to the United States because they want to pursue that. So I think I say that just because it's important for people to understand that in order to continue to maintain that leadership that allows us to do rare disease research and help us get closer to a cure, we need more people focused on why that NIH investment is so vitally important and ultimately how that's going to translate to improve the life of the person who's having the conversation with their friend, neighbor, person in their church, what have you, as to why they should help join our cause and get involved.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I had no idea that our budget was so much larger than some other countries. It's very interesting. I think those are all the questions we have, and we're coming up on time. So thank you so much, Kevin, for answering all of those questions. And thank you so much to our attendees for your participation.
Great. Thank you all very much. And I hope everybody has a really wonderful International Myotonic Dystrophy Awareness Day.